with Fair Districts, Georgia. And as you can hear, we are recording. So hopefully you'll all give us your consent for that. It's really important for us to be able to record these so that we can have an even greater reach with folks being able to come back and review this material later. All of our past town halls are on our website. If you've missed any, you can check them out there as well. While we are waiting for a few other folks to join, we had quite a few registrations for today. And we know there's a lot going on out there right now. So we're pleased that you're here. So as is our custom, please let us know who's here. Put your name and your and location in the chat so that we can kind of see where folks are coming to us from. Get my chat up here so I can see. Welcome, welcome. Oh, and Cindy.
Ooh, your sound's going all warbly, Janet.
The link for being able to, they're available on our website. Cindy, I don't see anything coming up in chat. Oh, Ken. Ken, we know Ken's here from Alpharetta. We hope he's here, given he's our main speaker today. Hi, Mary from Dahlonega. Is that how you say it?
Dahlonega.
Dahlonega. Sorry, you can tell I'm not a native Georgian based on that. And I see Pam Woodley's here. Joyce from Stone Mountain. Hey, Joyce. Michael from Atlanta. Pam DeKalb. Welcome, welcome. I'm going to just give like maybe another minute. So we did have a lot of folks that registered, and we're hoping that they can join us at the start. Kyron from Roswell, Tom from Mableton. So we've got folks from around the state. We always enjoy seeing that. Sometimes we even have folks from outside of Georgia. Bruce from Athens, Georgia. Great, thank you. Thanks for joining today. Okay, well, let's do a few housekeeping things before we get the main program started. If your name on your screen is like iPhone 1 or something like that, can you please let us know who you are? Looks like when I'm looking through here, it looks like we've got names for folks, so we appreciate that. We will be using the chat as the way to really have some questions accumulated during the program itself so that we can go back to those when we get to the Q&A section at the end. So please make use of that. If there's a question that you have along the way, so you don't forget it, just go ahead and put it in the chat, and we will get to it at that time. As I mentioned, we are recording this program, and we want you to make use of that. If you think it was a valuable program, recommend it to your friends. And again, check out the past recordings that we have available for you. So today we have kind of an in-house, I would call it, presentation. Sometimes in the past we have had guest speakers from both in the state experts as well as national speakers for these town halls. But today you're going to have the benefit of some of the internal research capabilities that we have here at Fair Districts. And I think many of you are familiar with Ken, who is our chair of our foundation. And he works very closely with our research team and has put together a lot of very interesting information for you today about this topic of whether we have competitive elections in Georgia. And I'll just give you a little heads up we don't. um, but Ken's going to really share with us the analysis in order to demonstrate that and to demonstrate what the possibilities are if we could have competitive elections in Georgia and what it would take for that. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Ken. And again, as we go through, please feel free to put your questions in the chat and we'll come back and have Q&A near the end of the program. Ken?
Well, thank you, Janet. And again, I'll add my welcome to all of those of you from around the state who've joined this program. This is a topic that we've been thinking about for a while, and we thought just leading up into the November 2024 election, it would be a good idea to visit this topic. And really the question is, does Georgia have competitive elections? And I'll say to Janet that we have some competitive, but not enough. And you're going to see which ones are competitive. And the good news is that it's possible to have more competitive elections in Georgia. We're going to show you where that could be true. And then the question is, well, if we had competitive elections, what would change around here? And the answer is a lot could change. So we're actually very excited by the possibilities here. So we're going to explore this topic in a little bit of detail. It's a bit of a data-heavy presentation. I'll try to tell you a story that kind of explains kind of what the data is telling us about competitive elections in Georgia. Again, if you have questions, you can note the slide number, and we'll try to come back to your questions. We will come back to your questions. So, do we have competitive elections? That's the question. And I first want to start by painting a vision. I want to talk about, imagine us as a state if we had competitive elections. What would it look like, right? Well, first of all, election outcomes would actually change with voter preferences, right? Your votes would matter. The major statewide races would be very close, and control of the General Assembly, that is the House and the Senate, could be subject to change every single time. Elections would be decided in November and not in the primaries, which is unfortunately what happens today in a lot of cases. And we would see more moderate legislators. Our view is that legislators who have to appeal candidates to a wider spectrum of voters would be more moderate as they go down and serve us at the Gold Dome, and your vote would always matter. And so the question is, this vision is attractive to us. We think this is a good idea. The question is it possible, right? So I want to start by looking at, first of all, I want to talk about why we're here. We are here because Georgia voters overwhelmingly want competitive elections. We did a poll, the first ever poll of redistricting back in July of 2022, jointly with other organizations. The key finding, the number one thing voters wanted from across the political spectrum was, by more than 3/4, people want competitive elections. They think it's only fair, quote, that elections should be competitive. But you're going to find out that we only have some competitive, but not enough. So this is what motivates us, is to say, this is the will of the voters. How do we implement this? How do we get there, right? So I'm going to just make a couple definitions here as I go through about what I'm talking about. So contested versus competitive elections. A contested race means generally there's at least two candidates, right? In this presentation, most of the time, I'm going to be referring to two candidates in the November election, not primary competition. We will talk about that on one slide. But generally, we're talking about, is there competition between the two-party candidates in November? That's what we mean by a contested race. But now, not all contested races are competitive. And by competitive, we mean a margin of victory less than or equal to about 7%, which means that the vote totals, the winner would have less than 53.5%, and the loser greater than 46.5%. So that range of 46.5 to 53.5 is what we consider a competitive race. You'll in the past, you will have heard people talk about a margin of victory of 10 points. Turns out research shows that in the 7-point range, you really do have competition. Outside that, it's kind of marginal. So we use a standard definition of margin of victory less than 7 percentage points. So I'm going to talk about contested and competitive races throughout this presentation. Those are my two definitions. Now, it turns out that we already have competitive elections for statewide races. This chart looks at the perspective of the Georgia voting preferences between Republicans and Democrats over the last really 2 decades. You can see that back in the early 2000s, the statewide vote here is votes for president, governor, and U.S. senator, right? The major statewide races, highly Republicanly concentrated in the early 2000s. But over the period of time from 2004 to now, that partisan gap has narrowed between preferences for Republicans and preferences for Democrats. So we've reached this point where we're a swing state, where if you look at the 2018, 2020, 21, and 22 elections, the major statewide races have been split. We had a very close Republican governor win in 2018. Then we had a president and 2 senators elected in 2020 and the 21 runoff. And then in 2022, we split the race between the governor was won by the Republican candidate, and of course, Senator Warnock won the Democratic race, right? So we've reached this world where we're in a swing state after many years of being quite a polarized state. So people say, well, Georgia is a polarized state. And what I claim is we're not so polarized as people think. And so we have arrived at the point where, in fact, our statewide elections are competitive. But let's look at what happens below statewide races, right? So if you look at, for example, at the state Senate, over this same period of time, what you can see is that the partisan gap has narrowed, but it is not enough yet to swing the election of the chamber. Look at 2016. There were 38 Republicans elected in 2016. That was, again, sort of pre-swing state era. The Republicans had a 10 district margin after that election, but it's narrowed to the point where now after the 2022 election, there's only a margin of +5 seats. And you can see, however, that the competitive number of competitive races was fairly small. Only 1 to 2 or 3 were in the last round. It was only one election, only one competitive race, and we'll talk about why that happened, right? So when we look at the election data, we can see the partisan gap is narrowing, so it follows the trend line on that first chart, but we're still not yet in enough competitive territory to where the chamber is up for grabs, if you will, right? We're not quite there for the state Senate. And if you look at what's happened in terms of contested versus competitive races, in 2020, half of the seats were contested, only 3 competitive. In 2022, not quite half were contested in the Senate, but there was only 1 competitive seat. And the thing that happened between 2020 and 2022 was a map was drawn. And it turns out that the way the map is drawn has a lot to say about who wins and whether the races are competitive. And that's one of the key findings that we have here is, maps are determining the election and the competition, and that's where we think we can fix things, okay? So that's what it looks like for the state Senate. But it's this paradox of there's fewer competitive races despite some contested races, right? Why is this? Why is it that we can have competitive statewide races but not in the state Senate? And the same story is true in the state House. In the state House, again, the partisan gap is narrowed from a +28 seat margin back in 2016 all the way down to a +11 after the 2022 election. But notice how the number of competitive races was very small in 2022, again, only 4 as a result of the map that was drawn in 2021. And again, same picture as before. Again, we're contesting maybe slightly less than half of the seats in the House, but all of a sudden we find ourselves with only 4 competitive races out of 180, which is terribly small, really terribly small. In fact, in 2022, if you look at between the Senate and the House, state Senate and the state House, 99 point something, I think it was 99.4% of incumbents got reelected. So again, we don't have a lot of competition when you get down to into these district level elections. And if you look at the 2022 election, if you do look at the 2022 election, the effect on voters was actually quite dramatic, right? Again, in 2022, we had a very competitive governor race, a very competitive Senate race, right? They were split, very competitive. All 3.9 million people voted in that election. Not bad for a midterm. Competitive races. The U.S. House, all the districts were contested, but not a single one of them turned out to be competitive at that level. And in the state House and the state Senate, if you just look at the way the votes were split up, at the bottom of the slide, only 5% of the votes cast in the state House were in a real competitive race. 45% of the votes were cast in contested but non-competitive races. Another 42% of the votes cast in uncontested, and 334,000 people just didn't bother to vote for state House. They didn't like what they saw on the ballot. That's 8%. So again, the effect of voters, your ability to cast a vote in a competitive race is very limited. It's at most 50% in terms of contested races, but only about 5% in truly competitive races. So again, this is a pretty dramatic impact on the way people the choice that you have as a voter. So the question is, so why is statewide different from district level elections? Well, statewide elections, again, what we're seeing is the demographic change and this dramatic change in voter preferences. They kind of go together. That causes our statewide elections to be competitive. But at the district level, you have three things that are different. Number one is that voters are self-sorting by geography. As we'll show you some maps in a second, you'll see how dramatic that is. Number two, then, is therefore the design of the map makes all the difference. And number three, at district level elections, your local voter preferences and actually turnout make a huge difference. You might know your state candidate for House or Senate because they live local to you. They could be a friend of yours, but you can go to their events. It's very easy to go get involved in those kind of local races. And therefore, the local voter preferences make a big difference. What I want to focus on here in this presentation is the self-sorting by geography, what we call political geography, and also the design of the map. So let's look at the state Senate. But before I do that, I'm going to talk about, we're going to be analyzing the 2023 remedial maps here. The 2023 remedial maps, again, these maps were drawn as a result of federal court order last November and December. All three maps, Congress, State House, and Senate, were redrawn under court order. The reason those maps were redrawn is to add Black majority districts to comply with the Voting Rights Act. You probably all remember this, having probably seen our town halls, and maybe you were down at the Capitol with us advocating about these maps. We were ordered to draw additional Black majority districts to comply with the Voting Rights Act. Well, the legislature did that. They added the required districts. And lo and behold, those new Black majority districts tended to be Democratic leaning districts, as you might expect. Not always true, but it was in this case. However, what the legislature did was they added the required districts, but they basically made other partisan changes that were unnecessary, and they did it to even the score. They said, we're not going to give up the majority that we have because we have to comply with this court order. And in fact, they freely admitted that they were doing this. Senator Cowsert from Athens, the committee secretary for the reapportionment committee in the Senate, said this map is designed to maintain the existing partisan balance. That all sounds fine and dandy, but he failed to say that many of us thought that those maps were biased in the first place from 2021. So again, they're freely admitting at this point that they are, in fact, the legislature is, in fact, making changes to keep for partisan purposes, which we knew, but they're being much more open about it, which I find pretty interesting. So let's now talk about the voter self-sorting question. We voters, the way we tend to live is we tend to cluster around different areas. So this is a map. This is the 2023 map that we're going to be voting on for the state Senate in 2024. You can see that there's high Democratic concentration around Metro Atlanta. Very difficult to draw a Republican district there. There's competitive regions like just north of Atlanta, down near Columbus, over on the east side near the Augusta area. There are some competitive regions, but then you also have very high concentrations of Republicans in the southern part of the state and northern part of the state. You basically can't draw competitive districts everywhere. So we have to understand that because of what we call political geography, the way we live as voters, not every district can be competitive. That's just the way we all live, right? And if you zoom in and look at this at a precinct level, this is just a drill down of the prior chart, you can see there is competitive space around the state. This area that's kind of goes from like the Augusta area, I'm kind of circling it over to Columbus. This is known as the Black Belt in Georgia. There's a lot of Black voters concentrated in this area, although they're sort of spread out across this area. So there are competitive spaces in Georgia, but there's a lot of concentration as well. But again, not every district can be competitive. There just aren't enough Republican voters in the Metro Atlanta area, especially in the closer you get to the center city, and there's just not enough Democratic voters, voters who prefer Democrats in the outlying areas. So that's just a fact of the way we live. If you look at the state house, you see a very similar picture. Again, concentrated districts in the Metro in the Metro Atlanta area. You can see very clearly here the Black Belt has some competitive districts in it. And again, high Republican concentration outside the metro areas of the state, right? So that's the political self-sorting, what we call the political geography problem. Same view again with the precinct level view, again tells you the same story. So the question is this: could these maps be drawn fairer to both parties? And in so drawing those maps, is there enough competitive territory to create more competitive districts? And the key question is, well, would there be enough competitive districts to put the General Assembly chambers in play? So that's the key question, is could we do it better? Could we have maps that are fair to both parties and enough competition to put the General Assembly chambers in play? That's the key question we're trying to answer tonight. So let's talk first about, could the maps be fair to both parties? In order to answer that question, we have to first say, what's a fair map in the first place? So we have said this before, we'll repeat these comments, is that we believe that fair maps should reflect the natural political preferences of voters, meaning the map should reflect that political geography. You're going to have lots of Democratic districts, lots of Republican, but there should be competition. These maps should encourage competition instead of eliminating it, right? So these maps should be drawn to encourage competition. These maps, of course, must reflect Georgia's diversity by providing sufficient districts complying with the Voting Rights Act, which is the subject of the court cases. And of course, we want to honor defined communities of interest, which is a key concept in terms of drawing maps in your community area, right? So that's what we think a fair map is: reflect the political geography and encourage competition, right? That's key. Now, how can we tell if a map is reflecting the natural political preferences? Well, it turns out there is a way to do it. And in fact, we did some work 3 years ago with the Princeton Gerrymandering Project. Many of you will remember this work that we did. And what we did was we basically Princeton drew for us 1 million maps. These 1 million maps all complied with traditional redistricting principles. They followed the guidelines that were promulgated by our state legislature. And if you draw 1 million maps at random, what you do is you draw these 1 million maps. They all comply with the rules. Excuse me, I've unfortunately went one slide too fast. Let me back up for a second. You can discover what the natural distribution of districts ought to look like. So in the state Senate, this is the picture for 1 million maps. 1 million maps say that the natural Democratic distribution would be anywhere from an even up to a -4. And on the Republican side, it would be 0 to +4. What it means is that the political geography of the state has a slight natural Republican tilt. And so the maps ought to reflect that. They ought to have a slight Republican tilt. But you can see some of the maps in this 1 million maps were actually 28 districts apiece. So the map could really be tied. But more of them are kind of in the +1 to +3 range. So it turns out that the maps of this 1 million that would earn an A grade would be approximately, for the Republicans, 29 to 31 seats, or +1 to +3 margin, and therefore the mirror image on the Democratic side, a -1 to a -3. That would be natural. And a map that reflected that would be considered fair. Now, in addition, we can understand, having drawn 1 million maps, well, but how many of these would be competitive? That's a key question. So here's the slide that explains the competitiveness. First, look at the left-hand side of the graph again. This is the Democratic portion of the prior chart that shows the A grade maps being 25 to 27. Notice that the map that was enacted had 23 Democratic districts designed. That's why this map earned an F grade from Princeton Gerrymandering Project. That's what happened. This map was clearly designed for a partisan political purpose. It earned an F because the data point they chose was way outside the 1 million maps, the 1 million simulated maps. On the competitive side, it turns out that the A grade maps should have anywhere from 2 to 6 competitive districts, as you see on the right-hand side of the graph. But the map that was chosen only had 1. It had 1. So again, this illustrates the idea that the map was drawn with a very particular partisan purpose. They know exactly how many districts they're giving to their side versus the other side. They're making them save seats, okay? But a fairly drawn map would be closer to the center of the distribution and would have more competitive seats. So the question is, if this were true, if we had more competitive maps, what would the range of possible election outcomes look like, right? So let's explore that. So This is the map that was enacted, right? It was a +5 for the Republicans, grade of F, with only one competitive seat in there somewhere, right? So it's a +5 on the Republican side and a -5 on the Democratic side. That map then was used in the election. Guess what happened? Exactly what the map was designed for is what the election came out as, a +5 for the Republicans and a -5 with only one competitive district. So the map basically drove the result of the election. But now we just said a minute ago, what if the maps were fair? Well, a fair map range would actually be fewer Republican seats, plus or minus a couple, right? So a map might be only a +1 for the Republicans to about a +3, therefore a -1 to a -3 for Democrats, right? So it still have that slight Republican tilt. But now if you add the fact that there could be 2 to 6 competitive races, what happens? Well, now what happens is that the range of outcomes could be anywhere from a Democratic win to a Republican win at the chamber level, because you can see that the competitive range now crosses the magic 28-28 boundary. And so this is a key result of all this work, is that it is possible to draw maps that are fairer to both parties and have sufficient competition to put the chamber in play. That is a very important result. And I don't think that result has actually been discussed much in Georgia, but that is a key result out of this work that says it is quite possible, given the slight Republican tilt, you could have a competitive map that's fair, that actually puts the chamber in play. Very, very important result in our view. Let's look at the state house. Similar kind of story, right? So again, 1 million maps were drawn. The natural distribution in the state house is about a +2 to a +9. The A grade maps, kind of the center of that distribution, is like a +4 to a +7 for the Republicans and a -4 to -7 for Democrats. That would be considered a fair map. Let's now look at the competitive part of that, right? So again, on the left-hand side of the chart, that's the A grade maps. You can see that the enacted map was kind of in the distribution. We gave the map a B grade because it was at least in bounds of the 1 million maps. That's better, much better than the Senate map, right? But on the competitive side, it's horrible, okay? The competitive, they made a map that had 7 competitive districts when the A grade map should have anywhere from 11 to 20. So clearly this map was designed for a whole bunch of safe seats, and it was designed for a political purpose, and we know what happened, right? So again, let's look at what happens in the election here, right? So again, what you have here is okay, this was the enacted map, as we just showed you, 98 Republicans, a +8 was the design point. How'd the election turn out? Well, the election turned out actually slightly more beneficial to the Republicans. That's just a result of an election. They earned a +11 seats in the election, and only 4 of the districts turned out to really be competitive, right? And so, slightly different result, but still the map kind of drove the result in terms of it was designed to keep the chamber in Republican hands and not have a lot of competition. So there was a big risk of that not happening, right? So again, what happens if we put the fair maps up? Well, fair maps are going to be much closer to the center point with a ±3. And now if you add the 11 to 20 competitive districts, now look what happens. With 11 to 20 competitive districts, there is lots of chance for the election to fall anywhere from a Republican controlled chamber to a Democratic controlled chamber, right? So again, same conclusion, same really important conclusion is that with a fair map that's closer to the center, but still correctly represents the slight Republican tilt, with competition, you have a competitive election for state house and state senate. This is a really key result to us. Now let's look ahead and say, so how about now? We got these new maps that were drawn in 2023. Are they more competitive? And what do we think that's going to do in the election for 2024? So again, the 2021 enacted map and the election result for the Senate, the 2023 enacted map looks exactly the same. It's a +5 for the Republicans, -5 for the Democrats, and 1 competitive district happens to be SD 48, which happens to be a Senate district up in North Fulton, Gwinnett, and Forsyth County. That district happens to lean Republican. But based on the last 4 election cycles, or last 3, 2018, 2022, that district could clearly be competitive according to with our partisan lean index based on the results of the last 3 elections at a precinct level. Okay. So basically what it says is that the Senate map in 23 that was enacted last year does not do any better from a competitive point of view. It really doesn't. State House, kind of similar story, right? So the map is still designed as a +8 for Republicans. It has 7 competitive districts like the original map enacted in 21 had. What we've added to this chart is also, what about if you expand the competitive margin from not just plus or minus, a 7-point margin to 10-point margin? Do we get more? Yeah, you get a few more. You get about 3 more on each side. So it's quite possible with the right kind of voting turnout, the right kind of competition, that things could be in play. But at the end of the day, it's still pretty much, it's the design point again is the same map. And again, the legislature admitted that they were, after they adjusted the map to add the black majority districts for black voters, they said we're keeping the same partisan balance. So again, they're trying to maintain the status quo, which, as we know, was a biased map in the first place. You can see there the list of which of those districts are competitive. And I'm not going to go through telling you where they are. You can look them up. They're kind of sprinkled across the different parts of the state. If you look back at the General Assembly contests for 2024, there was some primary competition. If you look at the state Senate contest on the left-hand side, there's 23 districts that are being contested in November. 15 had only one candidate from each party. 8 of them had some primary competition, but also one from each party. So we've got 23 that are actually contested in November. The other 23 were uncontested, 10 were decided in the primary. On the state house side, you have about 50% of the districts, 91 being contested in November. Of the uncontested races, 16 had primary competition, but 73 basically are the person's a shoo-in. It's a whoever filed gets the seat. That's how it works. So that's kind of a view of the General Assembly contest in 2024. And so how are we doing at contesting the races? Well, we're back up to about half, maybe 48% of the districts are being contested in the General Assembly. We have no idea what the result will be. Again, we wouldn't expect a huge number, but we could be pleasantly surprised. We will be coming back to this. We will be analyzing the results of this 24 election in December at our next town hall, and you'll see the answer. You'll see this chart filled in to see, well, what happened after all this, right? Again, so we haven't gotten to the point of contesting more than about half the races in the General Assembly. We don't know what competition is actually going to look like, but we suspect not a huge improvement just based on design of the maps. Okay, I haven't said much about the congressional map, so I'll give you a quick update on what happened with the congressional map over the same time period. Remember, we've got this transition to a swing state from a highly Republican state. In 2018 and 2020, this swing state status resulted in a narrowing partisan gap. Remember, two Georgia congressional districts flipped, the 6th and the 7th. They became competitive, and they actually changed hands in 2018 and 2020. So our congressional delegation that we sent to Congress in 21 and 22 was 8 Republican, 6 Democrat. In the 21 redistricting cycle, the A grade map would have stayed the same. It would have been 8-6. The boundaries would have shifted to account for population, but an A grade map would be 8 Republican, 6 Democrat, with anywhere from 0 to 2 competitive. What did we get? We got a 9-5 map that was enacted by the legislature with no competitive, and it was graded a C. 9-5 was okay, but not great, but literally no competition. So after the court, and again, the 2022 election, guess what happened? 9 Republican, 5 Democrat got elected. 2023, the court ordered redistricting, ordered us to draw 1 new black majority district. That was done. The Georgia 6th congressional district was reconstituted on the western side of Atlanta as a district favorable to black voters. However, the legislature said, well, we can't give up another Republican seat. So what they did was they took the Georgia 7th congressional district, which was actually a minority coalition district, meaning it was a minority white, but it was a majority constructed of Black and Asian and Hispanic. It's a very diverse territory up in Gwinnett County area. They basically blew up the 7th district and turned it into a very, very conservative majority white district. And that now became a new Republican district predicted on the map. So again, the map design is still pointing to a 9-5 result with, again, no competitive districts involved. So the kind of the story of the congressional map kind of mirrors what happened with the State House and the State Senate. We're just not giving you that much detail about it here. Now, what happens when you elect a legislature that has pretty much they have safe control of the chamber, right? Back in August of 2022, we went back and looked at what happens with some of these very controversial or highly partisan legislation things going on in the legislature. And what we found was that when you have highly partisan votes in the legislature, and they're not all highly partisan, but many of them are, the fact that the seats are safe and one party controls, they're able to push through a lot of these policies. So we looked back in 2022 and we looked at 4 different issues here: Medicaid expansion, gun rights, reproductive rights. We've added for this deck election integrity. And we looked at what did voters want in terms of public polling. That a lot of the AJC, Atlanta Journal-Constitution, there's a lot of polling. They asked voters what they wanted. We looked at what bills were considered in the legislature, and we looked at what the votes were in the legislature, and then we compared those votes to how would those votes have performed differently under a map that was not biased, right? So I'm just going to pick a couple of these to show you what happened, right? So, for example, if you look at the gun rights law, some of the gun rights laws, and one in particular we'll look at is what was called constitutional carry, passed in 2022. 70% of Georgia voters in polling said they opposed this idea. The AJC polled it before the legislative session. 70% said, no, this is a bad idea. It passed anyway. The vote we're citing here is the Senate vote. That vote carried in the Senate by 4 votes. Again, it was a 5-seat majority. It was a 4-vote win margin in the state Senate. But the map at that time, we believe, was biased by approximately 1-4. Well, if that map had been more even, that bill might not have passed. And especially if you had 1-7 competitive seats that were lacking in that map, things could have been very different. That bill might not have been written the same way. Perhaps it wouldn't even have passed. It's hard to judge these things. You can't go back and, reprove history. But you can look at some of these votes and say, how close was the winning margin in the vote to the map bias that we know is out there, right? Take a look at the recent election integrity bills, right? We have two bills that passed, the SB 202 in 2021 and SB 189 in 2024. I bring these up because, as you all know, right now, the makeup of the state election board has been changed as part of the result of these 2 bills, along with many other things about the elections. Prior polling said that 58% of people found that there was no fraud, there was no need to address these issues. People opposed limits on absentee voting in drop boxes. We got them anyway. Okay. If you look at the 2021 SB 202 bill, it passed in the House with a 10-vote margin when the map bias about 1-7. In the Senate, it passed by 5 votes. That was the party line vote, strict party line vote. Map bias of about 1-4, but again, no competition. And so how would it have been different? It's quite possible it could have been different, right? The last one I'll highlight here is the abortion bill that was passed in 2019, what's called the Life Act. Some people know it as the Heartbeat Bill. That vote passed in the House with a 2-vote margin in a chamber that had a 15-seat Republican majority. Only 2 votes made it pass. The map bias was at least 1-8. I dare say that one probably wouldn't have made it. That one probably would not have survived legislative action had the map been more fair and a different legislature elected in that time frame. Okay, let's return to why are we here, right? Overwhelmingly, Georgia voters want competition, and as you can see, we don't have it for state House and state Senate and Congress, but it's certainly possible to have it if you draw the maps fairly and you allow and encourage competition. So that's kind of the conclusion, right? Is that we could have this, we would have elections and votes that matter. The legislature would respond to changes in voters' preference. If more Democrats are voted in or more Republicans are voted in, the legislature would have to respond to that. We'd have more moderate candidates, we believe, less partisanship and more compromise. And look, just like in business, competition breeds excellence. Let's get people competing for seats, and you would have clearly, in our view, better legislators. And ultimately, this is all about voters getting to choose their legislators instead of the other way around, which is what happens today when maps are designed like this. What can you do about it? Well, number one, register and vote. Turnout can create more competitive races. Look at the chart on the right-hand side, 2022 midterm, 52% of the voting age citizens in Georgia voted, 40% were registered but didn't bother, and 8% didn't even register, right? So again, there's a lot of territory to improve in terms of voter turnout. We're expecting more because it's a presidential race, but still presidential races might get to 75% vote. The more people that vote, you can create more competition in these races in your area. Ask your candidates to sign our pledge. We'll talk about that in a second. And then get involved. You can volunteer, you can run for office. There are things that you can do to get involved in this process. Today in the Washington Post, there was a really interesting article that was posted about a candidate who's running in North Carolina. And her platform basically is, I'm the losing candidate. I'm running to demonstrate that gerrymandering is making me a loser. That's kind of how she pitches herself. But the bigger point of the article is that Georgia is not alone. Across the country, there are many places where elections are, especially at the state legislative level, elections are being decided in primaries. There's not a lot of choice across the country, and gerrymandering has clearly made an impact and really limiting competition across the country. We are not alone, but it's clearly something that, Georgia is not so polarized that it can't be fixed. That's kind of one of our messages tonight. Pledge, right? We have a pledge campaign that we're running right now. Janet Grant is leading that effort. Ask your candidates to take the pledge. They've all been asked through an email campaign to take the pledge, but feel free to print out the pledge off our website. Take that pledge to your candidates' events. Ask them to sign. Tell them you care about this issue. Tell them that 3/4 of Georgia voters want this issue fixed. They want more competitive elections. Get on their radar screen, get in their face basically, and ask them to sign. I've done that, and I've got a couple people to do that. And we're making some progress on this pledge campaign. We're doing better than we did 2 years ago. Okay, I think we'll stop there and head to Q&A. So I'll stop sharing my screen. Hopefully that was useful material to you all. And Janet, I'll ask you to go ahead and field whatever questions we've gotten, and we'll take your questions.
Okay, thank you, Ken. Now is the time to put your questions in the chat. We've got probably about 15 minutes left. And so we can dive into this in a little bit more detail. Looking for questions from folks or comments. The first question that I was thinking about, Ken, while we wait for questions from others, is that you touched on at the end with the article from the Washington Post, which I loved that article as well. I loved her kind of gumption. But that was going to be one of my questions. Is Georgia an outlier? Or I think I remember some statistics that you've shared in the past that did say that we have less contested races than kind of average, but maybe you can weigh in on that.
Yeah, I don't know. We're still a bit of an outlier. I don't know what the current stats are for 2024 in terms of, contested races for legislature. I know that in 2020 we were well behind across the country. 2/3 of races were contested. We were like half. I think we're probably still a little bit of a laggard. We're kind of holding at that 50% mark. I honestly don't have my fingers on the stats. I think we may be in the range now where everybody else is. I will say that nationwide, gerrymandering continues to be an issue, and it's causing a lot of people to feel like we do.
Great. Okay, Michael's question is, when is the sweet spot in terms of timing for when Republicans will want to negotiate on the maps?
Oh, that's a great question. That is a great question. Our point of view is that if the demographic trends in Georgia continue, the demographic trends are driving us towards this swing state model, right? We're not here to predict outcomes of elections, although I will say everybody thinks the presidential will be close again. So I think we're still in swing state territory at the statewide level. I don't think anybody expects either candidate to run away with it. But what's happening is, as you saw, the margin in the state Senate and House are slowly changing, right? Um, I think it's quite possible that it narrows between now and 2030 to the point where could one of the chambers flip? Could the governor's race in 26 change things, right? If the trifecta, the Republican trifecta is broken and now there's shared power in government, all of a sudden both parties get very interested in a fair process because they don't know who's going to control the redistricting in 2031. So our view and what we are preparing for, frankly, is trying to build momentum across the state for letting legislators know that gerrymandering is an issue, letting them know that voters want it fixed, talking to legislators about what are the fixes. Let's ban mid-cycle redistricting. Let's ban prison gerrymandering. I mean, the gold standard would be a citizens commission. That's a hard one to get because it's a constitutional amendment. But let's at least have fair standards. Put those into law, right? So having that agenda prepared so that when the one of the chambers gets close enough to make them nervous, right? If you have split government, you suddenly have a reason to talk to the other side about making a deal. So when is that? I can't predict that. I know there are people out there predicting that the House flips before the Senate or whatever. It's really hard to tell. I think we'll have another data point now in November. But we frankly believe that trend will continue. The demographic trend is pretty compelling. And if you look at voting registration stats and stuff, it points to that. Don't ask me when, but we know we know it when we see it. And I think that, I will say this, Janet, you have fielded a lot of pledges from legislators. Aren't a lot of them saying, without us even asking, that this is one of their platform issues?
Yeah, yeah. Everyone that we get, I do a little research on them, and I've been pleasantly surprised to see how many folks have this as an issue on their platforms on their websites. So it's definitely something that is getting attention. Unfortunately, more solidly on one side of the aisle than the other. But it's definitely, I think, raising visibility on the issue. The other thing I was going to mention, Ken, maybe you can tell a little bit more detail on, is why we think Virginia is a kind of a story that may be applicable to Georgia.
Oh yeah, that's I keep forgetting the history. You know the
Mhm.
history better. So Virginia is another state in which voters, like Georgia, cannot put something on the ballot that asks for a citizens commission or a constitutional amendment. We don't have the ballot initiative process in Georgia. They do in Ohio. There's a big battle going on in Ohio this time around. But in Virginia probably what, a half a decade ahead of us in terms of what happened, right? They saw the trend shifting from a Republican dominated state to a more balanced state. They went after and tried to and put anti-gerrymandering, was it an amendment, Janet, or was it a law? I think it was an amendment in the Constitution, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Went through the legislature twice, which is the process in Virginia. The legislature supported it because the Republicans and Democrats were split. They said we better sign up for a fairness process. It finally passed in 21, was it?
Hmm.
Somewhere in there.
Hmm.
And so they had a commission process to do their maps in last time around. And so Virginia, we're kind of like Virginia in that you got to go through legislature to get this done. But because the preferences were shifting, I honestly think that when we talk to Georgia legislators, they see this coming. They're not dumb. I think they can see the writing on the wall. The question is, when will they be compelled to act? And Virginia is a great case study of um, it can be done. It just, you got to get to that point where the legislators think there's really a risk that they don't have an ironclad control in 2031. We're kind of like halfway through the decade next year, right? So we need to continue pressing on it. I also think that there's incremental wins. Like we could get a ban on some forms of redistricting, like mid-cycle, where they do it not waiting for the census. Happens all the time in Georgia. That could be an easy bipartisan win that starts to demonstrate their willingness to change, right?
Hmm.
Um, So Virginia is a very instructive case. I agree with you.
Okay, Karen and Bruce Menke have an interesting question. Might demographic changes make it more difficult to engage in partisan gerrymandering since most of the growth is in the Atlanta area?
Could demographic changes make it more difficult? Well, I think that you're going to see additional concentration in the blue areas. That's what I think is going to happen. Now, having said that, you might see more competitive territory open up. Will it be harder to draw a red map or a blue map? Maybe. It's possible if demographic change is dramatic enough, but we're still pretty separated in terms of political geography. There's not enough competitive territory. It depends on exactly where the growth is. So that could be different by 2030. It might be much harder, but again, cheater's going to cheat. Okay, there's a lot of flexibility with computers and drawing maps the way you want them to be drawn, right? So could it be harder? Yes. I don't think it would. I don't think it could be prevented necessarily. Georgia would have to be really dramatically different. But I think the demographic trend is pointing in the right direction towards voters wanting this fixed, more balance in the legislature. I see it coming. It's hard to predict whether demographic change on its own would make that happen, or does an election have to kind of intervene in there and say, all of a sudden, state house changes, now it's tied. What happens? A very interesting question.
Mhm. Um, Michael is asking the question I was going to ask as well. So how do we move forward? What are the next steps? As you mentioned, we're going to be almost halfway through the decade here this next year. And in 2030, what needs to happen by then to make this a different story coming out of 2030?
I think we have to get more legislators on board, first of all, right? I think we have to talk to both sides of the aisle and let them know that this is in their best interest to engage in a fair process. And it's not difficult. It can be done, right? I dare say that I don't think that, well, I don't know if there's any legislators on our call tonight, but I dare say that probably not all legislators would realize how close it could be with adding the competition on top of fair maps, right? I don't know if they know that. And I think that's an interesting data point for the Democrats and the Republicans to say this could be dramatically different. It very well could be. And so we have to start building, raising awareness there. I think that we have to do a lot of grassroots organizing. I think we have to get at the community level so that in all across Georgia, we have people who are aware of this issue, who are making it part of their vote in every election, right? So getting more legislators pledged, bringing the message to your community. Anybody out there, if you want us to come and do a community meeting, we'll do it. We'll get in the car and drive. We'll do it on Zoom. Help us spread the word. The more people we educate about this subject, I like the fact that more legislators are on their own volition saying this is an issue. That demonstrates awareness. The national perspective clearly is that this is still an issue. So unfortunately, gerrymandering is still in the news, but from our perspective, it's good that it's still in the news since it's still a problem. We don't want it to disappear, right? So I think it's awareness. I think it's advocacy. I think it's education. I think it has to be done at a grassroots level, city by city, community by community. Let's make this an issue. And all of you tonight could be a part of that process. You could simply say, I want to hold a community meeting. It could be 10 people in your community. It doesn't matter. We'll come and start spreading the word, right? I think that a lot of this is getting communities involved, right? And by the way, there's a piece of work we're doing now to look at your county commissions and your school boards, where this is also an issue. And we're doing some work to understand how those maps were drawn. Of course, that's much more of a community level, but that could be a very interesting conversation to bring to your community around. Let's talk about your state reps and your congressperson, but also what else affects your community in this, right? So be our eyes, ears, and arms and legs out there, folks.
Okay, I think we have time for one more question, and this is an interesting one. Um, from Anne Fenstermacher. I think I'm probably murdering your name. Sorry, Anne. With the unfair bias towards Republicans, I feel it's criminal for Democrats to ask for money to run against a Republican when it appears they can't win. Is there a lawsuit that could stop gerrymandering on that basis?
Um, I'm not sure I buy the premise there. I think that, you know, as this woman in North Carolina is demonstrating, run, get out there and run. Let the majority party. I mean, this could change in 10 years. Maybe we have Democrats in charge. You need to go out and make. You got to build. You got to find ways to contest races. I know it's hard. I ran for one of these state house races myself. Raised a bunch of money, didn't make it. Okay, it was a good experience. It's not easy. But she's this democracy crusader in North Carolina. She's running purposely to make the point, right? So you say criminal to ask for money. I think part of the political process is deciding to go run, challenging these unchallenged seats. There's a whole organization, by the way, and I'm trying to remember the name of it, that encourages Democrats. Right now, it's Democrats doing this. I'm not sure if there's a one equivalent on the Republican side, but trying to contest every seat. Jen, do you remember the name of the organization? I don't remember the name, but like
Contest every race, yeah.
contest every race, right? Right. So I don't think there's anything criminal about it. I think it's important to try to contest these races. And by the way, I don't want to discourage you from voting. Let me be clear about this, right? Um, the maps are biased. A lot of the outcome, you know, you could say is predictable, but it might not be if the half of the people who didn't vote in 2022 suddenly vote. What changes? A lot could change. So, you know, I'm not sure I buy the premise of Anne's question there. She can follow up if she wants with another question, but I'm not sure I quite buy the premise. I think you need to contest it. When you're contesting a race, when you're running, you need to ask for money. It's just part of the process, unfortunately, but it's the way it is.
And I just put the link to that article, the Washington Post article, in the chat. One of the other things that she says in the article, which I think will be interesting for you, Anne, too, and others, is that she's also running based on some statistics that there are, some evidence that there is that even if she doesn't have a chance to win, she may bring out other voters that could make a difference in other races. So, so check that out. And as Ken said, I think there still can be value even when gerrymandering makes it very difficult. I've been impressed with some of the candidates that have taken our pledges, and I always also check, you know, what that lean is in the district they're in to know whether, you know, they're really in a competitive race or not. And there's some pretty enthusiastic folks out there that probably, according to our map statistics, probably don't have a whole lot of opportunity for winning their race, but making a difference in their community in the meantime. So with that, I think we are out of time, and we want to be respectful and end on time. So you will see in the chat an evaluation. You'll also be getting that, I think, through Eventbrite. We'll be sending that out to you as well. We always value your opinion on these town halls. And again, just a reminder that these are all posted on our website. And one way to start sharing this out in wider groups is to recommend this recording from this program to your friends. As Karen and Bruce said, I'll be sharing this recording of the program with a dozen or so groups in Athens. It's another way to share this important information. And with that, just a reminder that we are an all-volunteer organization, and we very much appreciate your donations as well. And we do have Another town hall planned yet for this year. We don't have, oh, we do have we have a range of dates. December 11th through 13th, somewhere in there. Stay tuned and we'll let you know when it is. Where we will take a look at what actually happened in the November election and what that means for our state house and state senate going forward. So with that, we appreciate you joining and have a good evening and get out and vote. Thank
Yep.
you.